I still remember the sound before I remember the faces. It was the pounding on the door at 2 a.m., fists against the wood like thunder shaking me out of my sleep. Emily was crying down the hall, her tiny 4-year-old voice echoing in the dark. Matthew ran into the bedroom, clutching his little blanket, his 6-year-old eyes wide with terror. And then came the shout, "Police, open up!" My heart dropped to the floor before my feet did. I stumbled to the door, half awake, half afraid, and when I opened it, the hallway exploded with flashlights. Bright white beams cut through the shadows, blinding me. Rough hands grabbed me, yanking me forward, my bare feet scraping the wooden floor. The metal cuffs clamped down on my wrists, cold, biting, final. I shouted, "What's going on?" "What is this?" But no one answered. The neighbors' lights flicked on outside, blinds shifting, faces peeking. My children watched their father dragged out of his own home like a criminal. I looked back once and saw Karen standing in the hallway, her arms wrapped around herself like she was the victim. Her eyes were wide, but her mouth was firm, set like a lock. She didn't cry. She didn't scream. She just watched. The sirens were waiting for me outside, bathing our street in red and blue. The night smelled of gasoline and wet grass, the kind of smell that sticks to you that never washes away. I tried to shout over the noise, "You're making a mistake! My kids, please!" But the door slammed behind me, and in that moment, I knew something in my life had ended. Not a day, not a chapter, but my life itself. And yet I didn't know how deep the fall would go. The ride in the back of the squad car was a blur of flashing lights and silence. My wrists ached against the cuffs, and I couldn't stop thinking about Matthew's face, pale and terrified. Emily's cries echoed in my skull like bells. I pressed my forehead against the glass, trying to convince myself this was some mistake that would be cleared up by morning. I was innocent. I had nothing to hide. How could they not see that? At the station, the air reeked of stale coffee and bleach. An officer shoved me into a chair under a flickering fluorescent bulb. Hours passed like minutes. Men came and went. Papers shuffled, voices murmured behind closed doors. No one told me anything. Every time I asked, they told me to shut up. My throat went dry from repeating the same words. I didn't do anything. I need to see my kids. Finally, when the door opened, I expected answers. Instead, Franklin Rhodes walked in, the prosecutor I would later come to know too well. He wore a dark suit, his tie perfectly straight, his eyes sharp like knives. He looked at me like he'd already decided everything. "Richard Thompson," he said coldly, "you're under arrest for attempted murder and domestic assault." The words punched me harder than any fist could. Attempted murder? Domestic assault? I laughed. Not because it was funny, but because it was impossible. That's insane. I would never... But Rhodes didn't flinch. He slid a folder across the table like it was already signed, sealed, delivered. Inside were photos I'd never seen, papers I'd never touched, statements I didn't understand, and then the last blow. "Your wife has made a full statement against you." The air left my lungs. My wife, Karen. The woman I'd shared a bed with hours before. The woman I thought I knew. The cell was colder than anything I'd ever felt. A steel box that smelled of piss and rust. They locked me in with a slam, the sound echoing down the corridor like a gunshot. I sat on the cot, my hands still shaking from the cuffs, my throat raw from shouting that no one listened to. My head pressed into my palms, and I tried to understand what had just happened. My wife guide had told them I tried to kill her. I pictured her face at the door. The stillness. The way she didn't flinch when they dragged me out. Had this been planned? Had she stood in the hallway rehearsing her tears before the police arrived? And why? What did I do to deserve this? The questions beat against my skull until my head throbbed. Outside the cell, voices and footsteps echoed, but none of them were for me. I was alone, already forgotten. The walls pressed closer with each second, squeezing the air from my chest. My kids were at home without me. Maybe Matthew was asking where I went. Maybe Emily was crying for her dad. I imagined Karen holding them, whispering lies into their ears, poisoning them against me. I wanted to scream. I wanted to smash my fists against the steel until the world heard me. But I didn't. I sat there frozen because some part of me still believed this was temporary, that the truth would fix everything by morning. But as the hours stretched, as the silence thickened, a darker thought crept in. What if this wasn't a mistake? What if this was the beginning? Before the cell, before the sirens, before Karen's betrayal, I was just a man trying to live a quiet life in a small town in Ohio. My name was Richard Thompson, and I was 34 years old, proud of the calluses on my hands and the grease under my fingernails. I worked at Thompson & Sons auto shop, the garage my father had started before me, fixing carburetors, changing oil, patching tires for neighbors who paid with a handshake and a smile. The smell of motor oil was always on me, but so was the smell of home, of Karen's roast chicken on Sundays, of Matthew's crayons scattered across the kitchen table, of Emily's dolls lined up on the couch like little soldiers. I wasn't rich, but I didn't need to be. My life was full in ways that money couldn't buy. Saturday mornings meant mowing the lawn while Matthew rode his bike in circles around me, laughing so hard he'd fall over, while Emily toddled behind Karen, tugging at her dress. Evenings meant sitting on the porch with a cold beer, watching the sun sink behind the maples that lined our street. Life was ordinary, steady, and I loved it that way. And Karen? Well, I thought Karen was the center of it. She had this way of brushing her hair back behind her ear when she laughed, and for years I believed that laugh was mine to protect. I never imagined she could hold secrets behind those eyes. I never imagined she'd be the one to put me in a cage. I was a father before I was anything else. Matthew was 6, curious, restless, already asking how engines worked and why the sky changed colors at night. I'd bring him to the garage sometimes, set him on an overturned bucket, and show him how to hold a wrench. He'd grin with missing teeth, proud of every little bolt he managed to twist. Emily was only 4, softer, sweeter, always clinging to my leg when I came home from work. Her hugs were the kind that melted every bad day away. I dreamed about their future more than mine. I wanted Matthew to take over the shop one day, to grow into a man who fixed more than just cars, but lives. I wanted Emily to feel safe enough to chase whatever dream she wanted, to know her daddy was always in the stands cheering. Those kids were my whole world. Looking back, that's what makes it unbearable. I thought I was building a foundation for them, a house filled with warmth, a family bound by trust. But all the while, something darker was rotting beneath the floorboards. Karen wasn't smiling the way I thought she was. She wasn't laughing the way I believed she was. She was waiting, watching, planning. When the cuffs cut into my wrists, I didn't just lose my freedom, I lost them. And I didn't even know it yet. There are nights in prison when the only thing that keeps you alive is memory, and when I close my eyes, I don't see the steel bars. I see the kitchen table with Karen pouring coffee into my chipped mug, steam curling like ghosts. I see Matthew running into my arms after school, his backpack half-zipped, his shoelaces undone. I see Emily sitting on the porch swing, her hair tangled, her little voice asking me to push her higher. These are the images I held on to when the darkness pressed too close. These are the moments that convinced me I wasn't meant to rot in a cell. Because how could a man who loved his family this much be the monster they painted me to be? But there's a cruelty in memory, too. Because the more I clung to those pictures of the past, the more I realized I would never get them back. Those mornings, those dinners, those nights, they were gone. Karen ripped them away when she told her lies, and the world believed her. And so when people ask me now who I was before prison, I don't know how to answer. Was I the father mowing the lawn on Saturday mornings, or was I already the man doomed to be dragged away in the middle of the night? Was I ever really free? Or had the trap been set long before the knock on my door? I was Richard Thompson, husband, father, mechanic, and in a single night all of that was erased. The betrayal didn't come with a scream. It didn't come with blood or broken glass. It came with words. Simple words. Words that carried more poison than any knife could. The first time I saw the police report, I almost couldn't read it. My hands shook too much, the black ink blurring into the white paper. But the name was there, clear as day, Karen Thompson. My wife, the mother of my children. She had stood before officers and sworn that I had attacked her in our home, that I had tried to strangle her in front of the kids, that I was a violent, dangerous man. I remember the way the room tilted, like gravity itself had turned against me. "This is a lie," I said, my voice cracking. She knows this isn't true, but no one cared. To the police, the signature at the bottom of the page was proof enough. To Franklin Rhodes, it was a golden ticket. To Judge Whitman, it was the foundation of a sentence that hadn't even been written yet. And all I could think was why? Why would she do this to me? We had fights, sure. Every marriage has them. Bills piling up, late nights at the shop, stress pulling us in opposite directions, but never violence. Never once had I laid a hand on her. So why this story? Why now? The image of her face that night haunted me. Calm. Too calm. Like she had already decided I was guilty before anyone else had. When Rhodes spoke in court, he didn't just accuse me, he painted a picture. He talked about a husband with a hidden temper, a mechanic whose hands were built for destruction, a man who smiled in public but turned into a monster behind closed doors. Every word dripped with certainty, and every sentence was sharpened to cut me into pieces. And then Karen took the stand. She wore a pale dress, one I remembered buying for her years ago. Her hair was pulled back, her voice soft and steady. She didn't cry at first. She spoke. Calm, collected, believable. She told the jury how I had cornered her, how I wrapped my hands around her neck while Matthew and Emily screamed. She said she thought she would die that night. She said she saw something in my eyes she had never seen before. Hatred. I wanted to stand up, to shout. That never happened. But my lawyer, Carl Jennings, tugged my sleeve, whispering, "Stay quiet. It'll work against you." So I sat there, my heart pounding like a hammer, while the woman I had once kissed goodnight spun a story that would chain me for 3 decades. And when her tears finally came, soft and perfectly timed, I saw the jury lean forward. They weren't watching me anymore. They were watching her, believing her, loving her. The betrayal didn't just end with Karen's words. It spread like fire. Neighbors who used to wave at me in the driveway now crossed the street. Friends who brought beers to my porch on Friday nights stopped answering their phones. Even my own kids. God, even Matthew and Emily. One supervised visit in the courthouse lobby, months after my arrest, Matthew clung to Karen's leg, his little face pale, his eyes darting away from mine. Emily hid behind her mother's skirt, her tiny hand gripping the fabric like she'd fall if she let go. Karen whispered something in their ears, and when I reached out my cuffed hands, they stepped back. My children, my blood, and already they were learning to fear me. That was the deepest cut of all. Not the cell, not the trial, not the chains, but the look in my children's eyes, a look planted there by Karen's lies, watered by Rhodes' speeches, and sealed by Judge Whitman's gavel. From that moment on, I understood. The truth didn't matter anymore. The lie had won, and I was the one paying for it. The day they showed me the so-called evidence was the day I stopped believing in fairness. A detective slid a folder across the table, his face blank like he'd already memorized the script. Inside I saw photographs, staged, manipulated snapshots that painted me as a monster. A broken lamp in the living room, a bruise on Karen's neck, dark and ugly. My hands shook as I flipped through them, my stomach turning. "This isn't real," I whispered. That bruise wasn't there, but no one cared. The detective leaned back in his chair and crossed his arms. "Your wife's testimony lines up with these pictures. Looks pretty real to me." And that's when it hit me. They didn't want the truth. They wanted a story. A neat packaged story of a violent husband and a broken wife. A story the newspapers could print. A story the town could believe. And I was the villain they'd chosen to play the part. I begged them to talk to my neighbors, to check my alibi, to look at the clock-in sheet at the garage from that night. But every word slid off them like water on stone. They already had their case. Franklin Rhodes was already sharpening his tongue for the courtroom. When the trial began, Rhodes strutted like a man who'd already won. He held up the photographs for the jury one by one, like a magician pulling rabbits from a hat. He called witnesses who spoke in half-truths, twisting memories into weapons. A neighbor said she heard shouting. She didn't mention that the shouting was Karen's voice. Another said he saw me storm out of the house, but not that I had left only after an argument about bills. Each word was a nail in the coffin. And my lawyer, Carl Jennings, sat there like a man made of wax, barely objecting, barely fighting. When he did speak, his voice cracked, his arguments thin. I wanted to scream, to shake him, to tell him to fight for me. But he just kept his head down, drowning in Rhodes's performance. And then came the pièce de résistance, a 911 tape. Karen's voice trembling, sobbing, telling the dispatcher that her husband was trying to kill her. I felt the blood drain from my face. The jury leaned forward. It didn't matter that her voice sounded rehearsed. It didn't matter that her tears came at all the right moments. It was enough. It was everything. When Rhodes pressed play again, I knew I was finished. The verdict came faster than I could breathe. The jury barely deliberated. When they filed back into the courtroom, their eyes never met mine. Judge Whitman read the decision in a voice that was cold, detached, like he was announcing the weather. Guilty. Guilty on all counts. 30 years. I remember turning to look at Karen. She sat with her hands folded neatly in her lap, her lips pressed together in a faint line. She didn't smile. She didn't cry. She just sat there like it was all part of the plan. My knees buckled as the deputies pulled me away, the chains around my wrists and ankles rattling like cruel applause. I glanced at the benches where Matthew and Emily sat, clinging to their grandmother's side. They didn't wave. They didn't reach for me. They just stared, confused, scared, poisoned by the story Karen had told. That was the moment I knew the world I had built was gone. Not just taken, erased. And as the cell door slammed behind me that night, I understood something I hadn't before. I wasn't just a man accused. I was a man buried alive in a lie. The courtroom smelled of polished wood and cheap cologne, but to me it smelled like a coffin. Every time I sat down at that defendant's table, chains clinking at my ankles, I felt like I was stepping into a grave that had already been dug. People say a trial is about justice, but mine was never about truth. It was about performance. Franklin Rhodes stood tall, his voice booming, painting me as a monster so convincingly that even I began to wonder if the jury could see me as anything else. He held the jury in the palm of his hand. Every pause, every raised eyebrow, every glance toward Karen was rehearsed. He spoke about me like I wasn't even there, a man with grease under his fingernails, strong enough to twist steel. Imagine what those hands could do to a woman's throat. His words slithered through the air, poisoning the room, dripping into the jurors' ears. I wanted to shout, to stand, to tear the mask off his face. But Carl Jennings, my so-called attorney, pressed my arm down and whispered, "Stay calm, Richard. Don't make it worse. Stay calm." My life was being shredded, my name dragged through the mud, and all he could offer me was silence. The trial wasn't mine to win. It never was. I remember the moment they brought Karen to the stand again. She walked slowly, her hands folded, her voice soft enough to make the jury lean in closer. She spoke about fear. She spoke about nights she claimed to have hidden in the bathroom, about whispers of threats I never made, about bruises I never caused. Her lies came out smooth, practiced, and I realized she had rehearsed them long before the police ever knocked on our door. When Rhodes asked her how she survived living with a man like me, she turned her eyes toward the jury and whispered, "For the children." Those words pierced deeper than any sentence Judge Whitman could hand down. She was using Matthew and Emily as shields, twisting their names into weapons, turning their love for me into evidence against me. I looked at the jurors' faces. Some nodded with sympathy, some frowned with disgust. None of them saw me anymore. They only saw the monster she had crafted. I clenched my fists under the table so hard that my nails dug into my palms. But I didn't make a sound. Jennings never objected, not once. He just let her speak, let her bury me alive in the words I couldn't fight. When the closing arguments came, Rhodes walked like a victor taking his crown. He painted a picture so vivid that I could see it in my mind. The monster husband, the fragile wife, the terrified children. He didn't need evidence. He had a story, and stories are stronger than truth when told in the right voice. Jennings, on the other hand, mumbled through his final statement. He stumbled over his papers, barely raised his voice, and when he looked at the jury, his eyes were already defeated. He didn't believe in me. He never had. And if your own lawyer doesn't believe you, what chance do you have? The jury left the room, and for a brief, stupid second I prayed they'd see through it all. I prayed someone would notice the cracks, the lies, the silence that screamed louder than Karen's tears. But when they returned less than 2 hours later, their eyes told me everything before the foreman even spoke. Guilty. The word echoed in my chest like a death sentence. The gavel struck, and in that sound I heard the final nail seal the coffin of the man I used to be, and as they led me away in chains, I knew justice had never walked into that courtroom. Only performance, and I was the one written to lose. The first night inside wasn't just a night. It was the end of the world I had known. When the gates clanged shut behind me, the sound wasn't just metal on metal. It was a coffin lid sealing. The air was damp, heavy with the stench of sweat, disinfectant, and something sour that never left the back of my throat. They led me down the corridor, the walls lined with eyes. Prisoners leaned against the bars, their voices sharp, mocking. "Fresh meat," one of them called, and the others laughed, a cruel, hollow chorus. Their laughter followed me like chains dragging across concrete. I kept my head down, but every step felt like walking deeper into hell. The cell they threw me into was a box. Rust stains on the toilet. Graffiti scratched into the walls. A mattress so thin I could feel the metal beneath it, pressing against my back. I sat there in the dark, listening to the echoes of men screaming, laughing, crying. Somewhere a fist hit flesh, followed by a roar. Somewhere else a man was sobbing like a child. I pressed my face into my hands, my wrists still raw from the cuffs. All I could see was Matthew's eyes, confused and scared, and Emily's tiny hands gripping Karen's skirt. I whispered their names into the dark, as if they might hear me, as if my voice could reach through the walls and the miles between us. But the walls didn't answer. Morning came, but the darkness didn't lift. A guard banged on the bars, his baton rattling against the steel. "Up, chow time!" His voice was sharp, impatient, like I wasn't a man but an animal to be herded. The cafeteria smelled like burnt coffee and spoiled milk. The food was a pile of grey mush slapped onto a metal tray, steam rising in weak curls. I sat at a table alone, the plastic fork trembling in my hand. Around me the noise was deafening. Trays slamming, voices shouting, fists pounding the table in arguments I didn't understand. I kept my head down, trying to disappear, but the more I tried, the more their eyes found me. One man walked past, big shoulders, tattoos crawling up his neck. He slammed his hand against my tray, spilling half of it to the floor. "Welcome home," he growled, grinning before walking away. The laughter of his friends followed. My stomach knotted, not from hunger but from the weight of humiliation. I wanted to scream that I didn't belong here, that I wasn't like them, that I was innocent. But that first week's sleep was a stranger. Every night was a battlefield of sounds. Metal doors slamming, guards shouting, prisoners fighting. Sometimes it was fists, sometimes it was worse. I'd press my back against the wall, pulling the thin blanket tight around me, my heart racing with every scream that echoed down the corridor. One night I heard a man begging, his voice high, broken. Then the thud of boots, the slam of fists, the laughter of predators. I wanted to cover my ears, but even through my palms I heard every word, every cry. And I realized something terrifying. If I wasn't careful, that voice could be mine. The guards didn't care. They walked past like ghosts, blind to the violence they had memorized 1,000 times. And that's when it sank in. There was no protection here, no safety net. The only law was survival. As I lay there on that cot, staring at the ceiling with graffiti carved deep into the concrete, I whispered again, "Matthew, Emily." I tried to remember their laughter, their warmth, their innocence. But even those memories began to blur, replaced by the echoes of this place. Prison wasn't just taking my freedom. It was trying to take my humanity. And I was only at the beginning. It didn't take long for the wolves to circle. In prison, weakness is blood in the water. And I reeked of it. A man who still smelled of the outside, who still carried pictures of his kids in his pocket, who still believed the truth mattered. They could see it in my eyes, and they went for it. The first time came in the yard. The sun was hot, but the air was colder than steel as men watched me from every corner. I kept my head down, pacing the track like I belonged there. But I didn't. A shove came from behind, hard enough to send me stumbling. I turned, and there he was. Broad shoulders, arms covered in ink, eyes dead and flat. "You don't belong here, old man," he hissed, though I was only 34. He swung before I could answer. My jaw exploded with pain, the taste of copper filling my mouth. I went down, fists raining on me, boots slamming into my ribs. The yard roared with laughter, guards watching from their towers but never moving. They didn't care. This was entertainment. This was routine. When it was over, I lay in the dirt, my breath shallow, my body aching. And in that moment I understood. This place wasn't just about surviving the sentence. It was about surviving the men who lived inside it. A few nights later, I sat in the cafeteria, my tray untouched. My ribs still ached from the beating, my lips split, my left eye swollen half shut. I tried to disappear into the noise, but a group of men surrounded me. Their grins told me everything I needed to know. "Pay up," one of them sneered, slapping my tray away. "New fish gotta pay rent." I didn't have anything to give. I barely had strength left to sit up. My heart raced as they closed in, fists tightening, ready to finish what the yard had started. But then a voice cut through the air. "Back off!" A man stepped forward, shorter than the others, wiry, eyes sharp with something I couldn't place. He had a scar down his cheek and tattoos curling around his forearms. He looked like someone who'd already survived 1,000 battles. The men hesitated, then laughed and walked away, muttering curses. The stranger sat across from me, sliding his tray over. "Eat," he said simply. His voice carried authority, the kind that made others listen. That was the first time I met Anthony Delgado, Tony. Tony was from Brooklyn, serving time for armed robbery. He never sugarcoated who he was or what he'd done, but there was something in his eyes, a flicker of humanity, a code. He wasn't soft, not by any stretch, but he wasn't a predator either. "You won't last a month if you keep walking around like prey," he told me one night in the yard. His accent was heavy, his words sharp. "These guys, they smell fear. You want to survive? You learn to stand tall even if you're bleeding inside." I listened. I had no choice. And little by little, Tony showed me the rules of survival. Don't owe anyone anything. Don't let anyone sit behind you in the cafeteria. Don't stare too long, but don't look away too fast either. Walk like you belong, even if you don't. He became more than just a cellmate. He became the only anchor in a sea determined to drown me. Nights when the screams echoed down the hall, when my chest ached from missing Matthew and Emily, Tony's voice kept me from breaking apart. "Don't let this place eat you, Richie," he'd say. "'Cause once it does, you're gone for good." And I clung to that. I clung to him, because if the system wanted to bury me alive, Tony was the one man helping me breathe underground. But in prison, even friendship came at a price, and I was about to learn just how heavy that price could be. At first, I lived for the mail. Every day after count, when the guard walked down the row tossing envelopes into waiting hands, my heart pounded like a drum. The sound of paper sliding against bars was hope itself, and in those early months the letters came. From Matthew, scrawled in the messy handwriting of a little boy who still missed his dad. From Emily, though hers were written by Karen's hand. Words like "Emily says she loves you," "Daddy" written in neat script that never felt like hers. I read those letters until the paper wore thin, until the ink blurred from my fingers. They were lifelines, proof that I was still a father, still loved, still remembered. But then slowly the lifelines frayed. Weeks passed with nothing. Then months. When a letter did come, it was short, colder. Matthew stopped asking questions, stopped drawing little cars and trucks for me. Emily's words, always filtered through Karen, became fewer, emptier. And then came the silence. Every day I waited. Every night I prayed. But my name was no longer called when the guard walked by. My hands stayed empty. My heart did too. That silence hurt worse than any fist ever could. The first visit after my conviction nearly broke me. They brought me into the visitation room, shackles clinking at my wrists and ankles, a guard hovering close. The room smelled of coffee and disinfectant, filled with voices, crying children, desperate hugs. And then I saw them, Matthew and Emily, standing beside Karen. My heart leapt, tears stinging my eyes before I even sat down. But when I reached for them, they froze. Matthew's little hand clung to Karen's sleeve, his face pale, his eyes avoiding mine. Emily hid behind her mother's skirt, peeking out just long enough for me to see fear in her eyes. "Kids," I whispered, my voice shaking. "It's Daddy." Karen leaned down and whispered something in their ears. They turned away. Didn't move. Didn't smile. My children, the same ones I used to carry on my shoulders, now looking at me like a stranger. I begged Karen with my eyes. But she sat there calm, almost smug. "You need to stop, Richard," she said softly. "This is confusing for them." Confusing. That was the word she chose to describe the distance she was planting between me and the only reason I wanted to live. When the guard pulled me away at the end of the visit, I wasn't sure my heart was still beating. The divorce papers came a year later. Plain manila envelope, slid through the bars like it was just another letter. The guard didn't even look at me. But when I opened it, the world tilted again. Karen had filed for divorce. She wanted full custody of Matthew and Emily. She wanted the house, the shop, everything. And she got it. Because what judge would side with a man chained behind bars, branded guilty of crimes he never committed? I signed the papers with a trembling hand, my cellmate Tony watching quietly from his bunk. "I'm sorry, Richie," he said, his voice low. But sorry didn't stitch up the wound. Sorry didn't stop the bleeding. That night I lay on the cot staring at the ceiling, the divorce decree pressed against my chest. My children were no longer mine. My home was no longer mine. Even my name felt stolen. The bars rattled, voices echoed, guards barked orders. But inside I was silent, empty. It was then I realized prison wasn't just built of steel and concrete. Prison was losing every piece of yourself until there was nothing left to hold on to, and I was running out of pieces. The letter that shattered me didn't come from Karen. It didn't come from Matthew or Emily. It came from my sister, Margaret. Her handwriting was tight, uneven, the kind of script you use when your hand shakes with grief. Richard, Mom passed away last night. I read the words over and over until the ink blurred from my tears. My mother, the woman who kissed me on the forehead every morning before school, who sat in the garage with me when I was 16, watching me rebuild my first car. The woman who always said, "You're stronger than you think, Richie." Gone, and I wasn't there. I wasn't there to hold her hand. I wasn't there to whisper goodbye. I wasn't even allowed to stand at her grave. Instead, I sat in a cage, the walls closing in tighter, while the only woman who had never doubted me was lowered into the ground. I pressed the letter to my face, breathing in the faint smell of Margaret's perfume, trying to imagine it was Mom's. But it wasn't. It was paper, ink, another reminder that the world was moving on without me, burying the only people who believed in me. One by one. That night the cell was colder than usual, and for the first time I felt something worse than anger. I felt hollow. After Mom's death, the silence from Matthew and Emily became permanent. Birthdays passed without a card. Christmases came and went without a word. I used to count their ages on the wall, scratching each year into the concrete with a piece of metal I'd hidden. 6, 7, 8. By the time Matthew turned 15, the scratches felt like a wound carved into the prison itself. I used to dream of walking into their graduations, of hearing them call me Dad with pride. Instead, I heard rumors, whispers from relatives in letters, fragments of conversations. Matthew had started playing football. Emily sang in the church choir. But I wasn't there to see any of it. I was just a ghost haunting them from behind steel bars. Every time I asked Karen for news, the letters came back unopened. Eventually, I stopped asking. Eventually, I stopped writing, because each unanswered letter was another nail in a coffin I couldn't climb out of. The worst part wasn't the loneliness. It was the thought that my children might actually believe her, that they might truly think their father was a monster. And if they did, how could I ever undo that? Years blurred into each other. One season melted into the next, the walls unchanged, the faces of guards rotating but all the same, stern, distant, indifferent. I lost track of how many winters passed, how many summers I never felt on my skin. The calendar became meaningless. I stopped waiting for letters. I stopped waiting for visits. Hope had been a fire once, but in prison, fires don't last. They're starved, suffocated, until all that's left is smoke. And then even that fades. Tony saw it in me before I admitted it. "You're going quiet, Richie," he said one night, leaning against his bunk. "You stop talking, you stop fighting, you're done. Don't let this place take that last piece." But I had already felt it slipping. The piece that believed there would be an end. The piece that believed truth mattered. Hope didn't die in one moment. It didn't explode or vanish. It just bled out slowly day after day, until one morning I woke up and realized I wasn't waiting anymore. I was just existing, and that was worse than dying. Time in prison doesn't pass the way it does outside. Out there you measure it in birthdays, holidays, paychecks, seasons. In here it's measured in counts, in chow lines, in the sound of keys rattling down the corridor. One day melts into the next until you forget what year it is. Until you forget yourself. I watched my hair turn grey in the scratched piece of metal that passed for a mirror. At first it was just a strand or two, then whole patches. My hands, once steady and strong from fixing cars, grew stiff, my knuckles swollen, the veins bulging like old ropes. My back ached in ways it never had before. I was 34 when I walked in. By the time I realized how much time had slipped, I was past 50. The worst part wasn't the pain. It was the way I forgot what living felt like. I forgot the smell of fresh-cut grass. I forgot the way Matthew's laughter sounded when he ran through the yard. I forgot the sound of Emily's voice calling me Daddy. I tried to hold on to those memories, but like photographs left in the sun, they faded until all I had left were outlines, shadows, ghosts. The world had moved on. And I was stuck, frozen in a time no one remembered but me. The men around me changed too. Faces came and went like waves. Some left in chains for the execution chamber, others in coffins under white sheets. Some were released, walking out into a world I couldn't imagine anymore. I'd watch them pack up their few belongings, shaking hands, smiling like they were alive again, and I wondered, would I ever have that day? Or was I meant to die inside these walls, my body buried in an unmarked prison grave? The guards stopped seeing me as a man. To them, I was just Thompson. Cell 32. They barked orders, shoved trays, rattled doors. I became invisible, part of the background noise of suffering. Even Father Walsh, the chaplain, would sometimes pat my shoulder and say, "God has a plan for you." But after 20 years, 30 years, those words felt empty. If there was a plan, it was written in cruelty. Every once in a while, I'd dream about walking outside. Just walking. No chains, no gates, no guards. The sun warm on my face, the breeze carrying the smell of spring. But then I'd wake up to the sound of metal doors slamming, and the dream would slip away like sand through my fingers. By my 3rd decade behind bars, I had become a ghost. I no longer existed for the world outside. Karen was gone from my life, free living whatever version of the story she had written. My children had grown into adults without me. They hadn't seen my face in years. Maybe they had children of their own now. Grandchildren I would never meet. Some nights I lay awake on the cot staring at the ceiling thinking, do Matthew and Emily even speak my name anymore? Or has Karen erased me completely, like chalk wiped off a board? That thought cut deeper than anything prison could do, because steel and concrete can trap your body, but being forgotten, that kills your soul. And so I drifted through the days like a shadow, a man still breathing but already buried. Until one day when something happened that I never expected. Something so small, so fragile, but it was enough to shake the dust off my bones. It came in the form of a forgotten file. It started with a whisper. Not the kind you hear in the yard or from the guards, but a whisper carried on paper. A letter slipped under the bars, stamped with a name I didn't know. Sarah Mitchell, investigative reporter. I stared at it for a long time, almost afraid to open it. After 30 years, hope wasn't something I trusted anymore. Hope was dangerous. Hope was a knife that cut deeper every time it vanished. But my hands tore it open anyway. Her words were direct. She had come across a box of old files during a records reorganization at the courthouse. Files that should have been destroyed or buried decades ago. Inside she found my case, and she noticed something the jury never saw. Inconsistencies. The timeline didn't match. Witness statements were contradictory. And more importantly, evidence had been suppressed. "Mr. Thompson," she wrote, "I believe there are serious flaws in the case that led to your conviction. I would like to meet you and hear your story in your own words." For a moment I couldn't breathe. My hands trembled so hard the paper rattled. After 30 years of silence, after being erased, someone, a stranger, was finally looking at me again. Not as a monster, not as a case number, as a man. And for the first time in decades, I felt something burn inside me, a spark. Sarah came to see me a week later. I'll never forget the first time I saw her through the glass of the visitation booth. She was younger than I expected, maybe in her 30s, with sharp eyes that didn't look away when they met mine. Most people averted their gaze, guards, prisoners, even family once upon a time. But Sarah looked right through the glass like she wasn't afraid of me, like she believed me before I even spoke. "Mr. Thompson," she said, her voice steady but kind, "I think you've been in here too long for a crime you didn't commit." My throat tightened. I had heard variations of that sentence in dreams, whispered in the dark but never in reality. "You don't know me," I muttered, my voice rough from disuse. She leaned forward. "I know enough, and I know your trial doesn't add up. Someone buried this case, and I want to find out why." Her confidence felt foreign, almost impossible. For years I had been nothing but a shadow, but in that moment, with her eyes fixed on me, I felt like a man again. I wanted to believe her. God, I wanted to, but part of me whispered, "Don't. Hope kills slower than prison, but it kills all the same." Weeks turned into months, and Sarah didn't disappear. She wrote letters, asked questions, dug into records no one had touched in decades. She discovered that one of the key witnesses against me had changed their story multiple times, but Rhodes had presented only one version, the one that damned me. She found police reports that were never entered into evidence, details that pointed to someone else entirely, and then came the biggest revelation, a medical report on Karen's so-called injuries, written hours after the alleged attack, described her bruises as inconsistent with strangulation. That report had been filed, then conveniently lost. Until Sarah found it. The day she sent me a copy, I sat on my cot staring at the faded typewritten words until tears blurred my vision. 30 years. 30 years stolen, buried, erased, and all along the proof of my innocence had been hidden in a file. Tony clapped my shoulder when he saw me clutching the paper. "Maybe this is it, Richie," he said softly. "Maybe this is the door." I wanted to believe him. I wanted to believe Sarah. For the first time in decades, I let myself, but deep down I knew fighting the system that buried me wouldn't be easy. They would fight back. They always did, and the battle was only beginning. I thought the trial that buried me was the worst fight of my life. I was wrong. The worst fight was clawing back from 30 years in the grave, demanding the world look again at what it had chosen to forget. Sarah knew she couldn't do it alone. She brought in a man named Mark Reynolds, a private investigator with graying hair and the kind of eyes that had seen too many lies. He wasn't the kind of man to waste time with pleasantries. "I've seen bad convictions before," he told me through the glass, his voice gravelly. "But 30 years? That's not a mistake. That's a cover-up." Hearing those words made my chest tighten. A cover-up. It wasn't just Karen's betrayal or Rhodes's ambition. It was bigger. The system itself had let it happen, maybe even helped it. Mark and Sarah began tearing into every piece of my past case. Subpoenas, interviews, late-night phone calls. They found retired cops who admitted evidence had gone missing. A juror who confessed she felt pressured into a guilty verdict. Even a former clerk who remembered Judge Whitman meeting privately with Rhodes in chambers before key testimony. Piece by piece, the lie unraveled. But as Sarah warned me, the truth doesn't set you free, Richard. It scares the people who built their careers on your chains, and scared people fight back. The state resisted every step. Motions denied. Hearings delayed. The prosecutor's office, now run by men who had inherited Rhodes's legacy, fought to keep me buried. Finality, they called it. As if truth had an expiration date. As if 30 years of my life could be brushed off with a single word. I sat in that courtroom again, older now, gray-haired, my back bent from years on the cot. And across from me were men in suits arguing that I didn't deserve another day in court, that my conviction was final, that even if mistakes had been made, justice had already been served. Justice. The word was bitter on my tongue. Mark slammed his fist on the table. Justice isn't served when a man loses 30 years of his life for a crime he didn't commit. His voice echoed in the chamber, and for the first time in decades someone was shouting for me instead of against me. Sarah leaned close and whispered, "Don't give up, Richard. We're breaking through." And for the first time in years I dared to nod. I dared to believe. The hearing stretched for months. Every victory felt fragile, every defeat like another shovel of dirt over my coffin. Some nights I lay awake in my cell, clutching Sarah's letters, replaying Mark's words, trying to convince myself this wasn't just another cruel trick. Then came the day Sarah walked into visitation with tears in her eyes. For a second I thought we'd lost, but she smiled. "The judge agreed to reopen your case." I felt my knees weaken. My hands shook so hard I dropped the phone receiver and had to pick it up again. After 30 years, someone in power was finally willing to listen. Tony grabbed me that night, pulling me into a rough hug. "You're getting out, Richie. I can feel it." His voice cracked, and for a moment even the walls seemed to listen, but deep down I couldn't let myself believe it fully. Not yet, because I knew the system. I knew how cruel it could be. Still, for the first time in decades, the door wasn't completely shut. It was cracked open, and I was ready to push. The morning they told me I was leaving, I didn't believe it. A guard unlocked the door and barked, "Pack it up, Thompson. You're done." For years I'd dreamed of hearing those words, and yet when they came they sounded unreal. Like lines from a movie I wasn't part of. I folded what little I had, a worn Bible, a few letters from Sarah, the stub of a pencil I used to scratch words into the wall. 30 years of life, and that was all I owned. Tony stood at the bars watching me, his face tight. "You're really walking out, Richie," he said. His voice cracked, and in it I heard both joy and grief. Because he wasn't leaving. He might never leave. When the guard shackled my wrists for the last time, I didn't even fight it. And the cuffs felt natural after so many years, like an extension of my skin. But when they clicked open at the gates, I rubbed my wrists, staring at the red marks. Freedom felt strange, alien. Then the doors groaned open, and the sun hit me. It wasn't just light, it was fire. It burned my skin, stung my eyes, filled my lungs with an air that tasted too fresh, too sweet. The world outside was loud, cars rushing, birds singing, the wind carrying scents of grass and gasoline. My knees buckled. After 30 years in concrete and steel, the real world was too big, too alive. I stepped forward anyway, blinking into a world that had forgotten me. Sarah was waiting by the gates, her hair pulled back, her eyes shining with tears. She reached out, and for a second I froze. Touch felt foreign. Human warmth felt dangerous. But then I let her hug me, her arms trembling as she whispered, "You're free, Richard. You're finally free. Free." The word echoed in my chest, but it didn't feel real. The parking lot stretched in front of me, filled with cars that looked too modern, too sleek. Billboards in the distance advertised phones and gadgets I didn't recognize. 30 years had passed. The world had sprinted forward while I was frozen in time. Mark Reynolds clapped my shoulder. "It's over," he said, his voice firm. But I shook my head. "No," I whispered. "It's not over. It can't be. 30 years. I can't get that back." The ride away from the prison was quiet. My eyes darted to everything. Traffic lights blinking, children crossing the street with backpacks, families eating at diners. Ordinary things. Things I hadn't seen in decades. My chest ached. It felt like watching life through glass, like I didn't belong to it anymore. And in a way I didn't. That night Sarah brought me to a motel, a small simple room, cleaner than any place I'd seen in 30 years. The bedspread smelled of detergent, the lamps glowed softly, and the bathroom mirror showed me a face I barely recognized. My hair was white. My skin sagged, my eyes. God, my eyes looked like they belonged to someone else. I sat on the edge of the bed, the silence pressing down. No bars, no screams, no guards shouting orders. Just silence. And instead of peace, it felt terrifying. I opened the nightstand drawer and found a remote. The television flickered to life, blasting colors and voices too fast for me to follow. Commercials about devices I didn't understand. Shows with faces I'd never seen. I turned it off and stared at the wall. Freedom wasn't what I thought it would be. It wasn't joy. It wasn't relief. It was emptiness. A hollow echo where 30 years should have been. I lay back, my hands folded across my chest, whispering into the darkness. Matthew, Emily, would they want to see me? Or had Karen's lies poisoned them forever? The gate was behind me. The world was in front of me. But my heart was still chained. I hadn't seen Matthew or Emily since they were children clutching Karen's skirt, afraid to look me in the eye. 30 years later, I barely remembered the sound of their voices. I imagined them frozen as kids, but in reality they were adults now, older than I was when I first went in. Sarah arranged the meeting. She warned me it might not be what I hoped for. "They've lived a whole life without you, Richard. Be patient." But how could I be patient? I had carried their names like prayer beads for 3 decades. They were the reason I hadn't put a noose around my neck when the silence became too heavy. When the door opened, my heart almost stopped. Matthew walked in first, tall, broad-shouldered, with streaks of grey already in his hair. His jaw was tight, his eyes hard, and beside him came Emily, her face softer, her eyes trembling with something between fear and longing. I stood, my knees weak, my throat closing. "Matthew, Emily." Emily's lips trembled. Matthew's didn't move at all. He just stared at me like I was a stranger. And maybe I was. The silence stretched too long. Finally, I took a step forward, my hands open, shaking. I missed you every day." "Every single day," Emily's eyes filled with tears. She looked down, clutching her purse, her chest rising and falling too fast. But Matthew, he didn't flinch. His eyes burned into mine, sharp, unforgiving. "You missed us?" His voice was deeper now, harder, but still held an echo of the boy I once knew. "You missed us?" Where the hell were you when Mom was crying? Where were you when we needed a father? You were in prison, Dad, prison. The word hit me like a hammer, prison. He said it like it defined me, like it erased everything else I'd ever been. My mouth opened, but no words came. Because how do you explain to your son that you were buried alive by lies? That his mother built a wall between you brick by brick? I didn't do it, Matthew, I whispered, my voice breaking. I never hurt your mother. I never hurt either of you. I swear on my life. Emily finally looked up, tears spilling down her cheeks. I believe you, she whispered. Her voice cracked, fragile as glass. Matthew turned to her, his jaw tightening, but he said nothing. Hope flickered in her words. But Matthew's silence was a wall I couldn't climb. The meeting ended too soon. Emily hugged me, but it was awkward, stiff, like hugging a ghost she wasn't sure was real. Her tears wet my shirt, her body trembling as she whispered, I don't know how to start over with you. I held her tighter. We'll start small, I whispered back. Even small is more than nothing. But Matthew stayed distant. When I turned to him, reaching out, his body stiffened. His eyes, cold as steel, locked on mine. You weren't there, he said. You'll never understand what we went through. And then he walked out, his footsteps echoing louder than the closing door. I stood there, my chest hollow, my arms still tingling from Emily's brief embrace. One child clinging to me with broken pieces of love, the other walking away with 30 years of anger. That night I lay awake in Sarah's motel room, staring at the ceiling. My children were alive, that they had grown, but I hadn't. I was still the man in chains, still the father who had missed every birthday, every graduation, every moment. Freedom had given me back the chance to see them, but it hadn't given me back what I had lost, and nothing ever would. They called it justice when Karen was finally exposed. Sarah's investigation, Mark's persistence. It all led to hearings where her lies unraveled piece by piece. The medical report she had buried, the witnesses she had manipulated, the bruises that didn't match her story. One by one, the truth clawed its way into the light. Karen sat in the courtroom this time, not me. Her once perfect composure cracked under the weight of questions she couldn't twist. She was charged with perjury, with obstruction, with fabricating testimony that had stolen 30 years of my life. Reporters crowded the hallways, their cameras flashing, their pens scribbling. They called her the woman who framed her husband. I watched her from the gallery. She looked smaller, older. Her hair grey, her face lined, her eyes avoiding mine. For a moment I wondered if she remembered the night they dragged me away. If she remembered Matthew's tears, Emily's cries. Did she regret it? Or was regret something people like her didn't feel? People whispered that this was justice, that I had won. But as I sat there, my hands trembling in my lap, I knew better. Justice isn't a gavel. It isn't a sentence. It isn't watching the woman who destroyed you finally get dragged into the dirt. Justice would have been walking Matthew to his first day of school. Justice would have been carrying Emily on my shoulders at the county fair. Justice would have been 30 Christmas mornings, 30 birthdays, 30 ordinary days that I never got back. When the verdict against Karen was read, the room stirred with gasps. Some people cheered, but I didn't. I just sat there hollow, staring at the floor, because what did it matter now? She could spend the rest of her life behind bars, and it wouldn't give me mine back. After the trial, Sarah touched my arm. Richard, you're free now. You can start again. I nodded, but my chest was heavy. Start again? At 64. My hands shook from age, my body worn from prison, my heart fractured from decades of silence. Starting again wasn't possible. Surviving, maybe. Breathing, maybe. But living? Living was something the system had taken from me long ago. Sometimes I walk outside now, feeling the sun on my face, listening to the sound of children playing in the park. I close my eyes and try to imagine Matthew and Emily as children again, running toward me, laughing, calling me Dad. But when I open my eyes, all I see are strangers' children. My own are grown, their childhood stolen, their memories poisoned. Emily visits sometimes. She sits with me quietly, telling me about her life, her job, the things she lost too. Her presence is a small light in the dark. But Matthew stays away. His silence is its own prison, one I carry with me every day. People tell me I'm free. But freedom is not the same as life. Life is gone. Life was taken. And as I stand at the grave of 30 stolen years, I know this. The truth came too late. Justice came too late. and time once lost can never be returned. So I tell my story, not for me, but for those who might listen, for those who might see the danger of lies, of ambition, of a system that can bury a man alive, because I may be free, but I will never stop being a prisoner of the years I lost.